Hey YouTube, it's Mike, the NYC Storyteller, and today we're going to be discussing how one woman ended up in the Guinness Book of World Records back in 1945. She is still in the Guinness Book of World Records today, and she will likely stay there as long as they keep printing the book. This tale might stir up some fear, trauma, and for those reasons, viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, I want to remind everybody that the goal of this YouTube page is to bring you fascinating stories about New York City from my perspective. And if that's something of interest to you, maybe subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell. That way you get a notification every time we do one of our weekly uploads. Also, please like the video, leave a comment, help us out with those YouTube algorithms, all that nonsense. It's almost like I wrote a script and can't remember what I was supposed to say. Anyway, let's get on with the story, shall we? A girl named Betty Lou was born in 1925 in a small historic town in Arkansas called Fort Smith. Fort Smith is in the northwest corner of Arkansas. On its western border is basically Oklahoma, and the northern end of it is the Arkansas River. Now, Betty Lou didn't really know too much about her family. She grew up in an orphanage, and when she was a teenager, she was sent out into the real world to do whatever with her life. She would meet a boy named Oscar Lee Oliver, and the two of them fell madly in love with one another. She was married by the time she was 18 years old. Now, the two of them were inseparable. They spent as much time as they could with one another, and the reason that they were doing that was because Oscar was a torpedo man, third class in the United States Navy, and they had met during World War II. So Oscar was sent back out into the war, and Betty Lou for the next 2 years would go to sleep every night saying her prayers, hoping that her husband would be able to lie next to her in bed again. In the summer of 1945, Betty Lou is waiting for her husband to come home. The war is almost over, and she decides, I'm going to go to New York. I'm going to spend the summer there, and when he comes back, he's going to go into New York, and that's where we'll meet up. And we'll spend some time in New York together, and we'll be able to go back home to Arkansas after that. When Betty Lou got to New York, she'd actually meet up with a cousin of hers that lived there already, and that cousin was able to help her find a job. She was able to work as an elevator operator at the Empire State Building. This job paid $35 a week, which seemed like more than enough to Betty Lou, and it seemed like a great opportunity to just be out with people, because the Empire State Building was best known for its observation decks at the time. So people would travel from all over to go visit these observation decks. Now, the observation decks at the Empire State Building are on the 80th floor, 86th floor, and 102nd floor, although a lot of people don't count the 80th floor. The 80th floor is an enclosed space, and that's where you would transfer to a separate elevator to take you to the outdoor observation deck on the 86th floor. The 102nd floor costs extra. That's the way it still is today. So Betty Lou's job was to operate the elevator non-stop from the first floor up to the 66th floor, and then at the 66th floor, she'd go floor by floor up until the 80th floor. Now, this was a very easy job, but she enjoyed doing it. She was able to meet new people every day, have fun conversations, and not really get too attached to anybody because she was in an elevator. How long can a conversation be in an elevator? Then, on July 28th, 1945, everything changed. It was a foggy Saturday morning. The Empire State Building at this point made most of its money from the observation deck. So the fact that it was a foggy Saturday morning, Betty Lou was not expecting a lot of people today. She was expecting most of those people to be tenants of the building. However, the Empire State Building for many years was nicknamed the Empty State Building because people refused to pay the prices of the office space. So she was expecting a very slow day. Betty Lou stepped into the elevator, went all the way up to the 80th floor. She put her stuff down in her office, said hello to any of the fellow employees, and then something that she liked to do was look out the window and check out what the visibility was like for the day. Now, on a clear day, you'd be able to see the Chrysler Building, Times Square, the Woolworth Building, all of those lower Manhattan skyscrapers. But today, none of that was visible. It was like looking out an airplane window while you're traveling through a dense cloud. So she said to herself, you know what? We're probably not going to get a lot of people trying to come to the observation decks today, but we'll make the most of it. Whoever goes into the elevator, we'll have a fun conversation with them, and that'll be that. So Betty Lou got into the elevator and got ready to take her first trip down for the day. And once those doors closed, her life would change forever. When the elevator doors closed, something happened. Betty Lou didn't even have time to press the button for the first floor of the building. There was this loud, thunderous sound that shook the entire building. In fact, the elevator rattled at such a force that it took Betty Lou off of her feet and she slammed into the wall of the elevator. When she looked up, the top of the elevator was gone. It had been replaced by some big, heavy piece of machinery that had swiped into the elevator. And into the elevator started pouring this burning hot black oil. The temperature rose so quickly in the elevator that Betty Lou thought her skin was going to melt off. She didn't know what was happening, but she was terrified. Now, in order to understand what was happening to Betty Lou, we actually need to leave New York and go to Massachusetts. In Massachusetts was Lieutenant Colonel William Smith, who had piloted some of the most dangerous missions during World War II. But on July 28, 1945, Captain Smith was given the routine task of transferring servicemen from Massachusetts to New York. And so he and a fellow pilot and a passenger would hop aboard his B-25 service bomber, and they would head for LaGuardia Airport in New York. When the plane arrived in the metropolitan area, Captain Smith was informed that the fog was maybe a little too thick around LaGuardia Airport, and so air traffic controllers wanted to redirect him to Newark Airport in New Jersey. Now, if you don't know your metropolitan area geography, that's okay. What you need to know is LaGuardia Airport is in Queens, which would be east of Manhattan, and Newark Airport would be in New Jersey, which is west of Manhattan. In other words, Manhattan is directly between these two airports. Now, the plane was already flying quite low because the visibility was better that way, and because they had already been preparing for arrival at LaGuardia Airport in Queens. However, the crew was specifically informed that they would not be able to see the tallest building in the world or the second tallest building in the world, which at that point in time were the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building. And so Captain Smith, knowing that he needed to be very careful, he slows down the plane, and bomber planes aren't particularly large, so they figured, you know what, we're going to take our chances. Unfortunately, though, that fog did hide those buildings very well, and very quickly the plane learned that they were headed in a direct path of not the Empire State Building, but the Chrysler Building on 42nd Street. Now, when the Chrysler Building actually came into view, the instinct, obviously, is to turn and get out of the way. However, the plane should have turned to the right. If they had turned to the right, they would have flown directly over Central Park. Would have been a much easier flight to get into New Jersey, but Captain Smith swerved left. And by swerving left, the plane was now on a direct, straight path at the Empire State Building. Moments later, when the Empire State Building did come into view, it was too late. And unfortunately, the plane would strike the Empire State Building between the 78th and the 80th floors. When the plane struck the building, the fuel immediately exploded and it sent flames as far down as the 75th floor. A woman on the 56th floor was actually convinced that the building would topple over. Even though she was more than 20 flights down from where the plane made impact, it was enough to throw her across the room as well. And when the plane actually crashed, the plane itself stopped. But one of the engines continued. In fact, one of those engines continued straight through the Empire State Building, went across the street, and landed in a penthouse across the street. The other engine was directly above Betty Lou. Now, the crash itself was enough to send Betty flying across the elevator, and when she made impact with the wall, she broke her pelvis, her back, and she had severe burns all over her. When she talked about the event later on, she said that all of that burning oil that was coming into the elevator, it felt as if hell itself had entered the elevator. Now, Betty Lou is screaming. She has no idea if she's making sound. There's this ringing sound in her ear. She's just praying, crossing her fingers that someone can hear her. And miraculously, there were people on the 79th floor where the plane made impact that weren't hurt at all. Betty Lou was about to be rescued. So these first aid workers come to Betty Lou's aid. They see how bad her injuries are, and they're trying to be very sensitive about it, but they need to get her out of this elevator. So they drag her across the floor, and they try to lift her up, and she's screaming in pain. They try to take her down a couple flights of stairs, but they say, you know what? This is bad. I think it would probably make a lot more sense if we could put her in an elevator that wasn't damaged and we lower her down that way. What these first aid workers failed to realize was the elevator that they were about to place Betty Lou into, the cable was melting. In the short time that Betty Lou had been placed on the ground in the elevator, and when the first aid workers turned around to go grab their equipment to join her in the elevator, that cable finally snapped. And that meant that that elevator car was about to free fall from the 75th floor of the Empire State Building. Now, Betty Lou is screaming for her life yet again within a span of just a couple of minutes. Remember, she has all of these broken bones from the plane crash, but she is now plummeting from the 75th floor of the Empire State Building. She is falling at such a speed that her feet were now pointed up at the top of the elevator. She quickly grabbed onto the railing on the side of the elevator, and she pulled herself into the corner. And she would crunch up her body, contort it into the fetal position, despite all of these broken bones that she has. And she would say a prayer because she was convinced she was about to plummet to her death. Now, the rapid compression of air that happens as the elevator car is falling down would actually help to soften the blow. But when the elevator car finally reached the ground level, it would continue into the basement. However, there was a great amount of cable that had actually formed underneath the elevator car. And so when the elevator actually landed, it would land on top of those cables as opposed to the actual floor. And this helped to soften the blow. However, the elevator is not the only thing crashing through this elevator shaft. There's also the second engine of this plane. So that is also going all the way down, and it would land on top of the elevator. So you have the elevator originally like this, and now it's like this. Now, first responders immediately rush to the scene, and when they get down to that basement level and see this crashed elevator, they're thinking to themselves, there's no possible way that anyone could have survived this plummet. But to their surprise, when they finally got inside the elevator, Betty Lou was still alive. An ambulance physician administered blood plasma. Her back was broken in 3 places. Her leg was broken in 7 places. She had this huge cut across her right eye. She was badly burned all over her body. She had suffered a concussion, and yet still somehow she was not only conscious, but she had survived a 75-story or 1,000-foot plunge from the top of the Empire State Building. Now, as for the 3 people who were on the plane, unfortunately all of them had passed on, as well as 11 people inside the Empire State Building. There was a total of 24 injuries. For the next 4 months, Betty Lou's home would be Bellevue Hospital. Doctors would come in and put pins in her legs, and that would cause her a great deal of pain. But the doctors were happy to know that because it meant that she still had feelings in her legs. Betty Lou would be in the hospital when World War II officially ended in September of 1945, and that meant that her husband could finally join her in New York. When he made his way there, he was able to be with her in the hospital for her final days, and when autumn time rolled around, she was able to walk out of Bellevue Hospital under her own power. She was able to walk out arm in arm with her husband. The 20-year-old Betty Lou Oliver somehow made a full recovery from her injuries, and as for Oscar, he received his honorable discharge on December 13th, so they would move back to Arkansas. Betty Lou and Oscar would go on to have 3 children and 7 grandchildren. She would live for another 54 years, dying at the age of 74, and she still, to this day, holds the record for highest free fall in an elevator, 75 stories or 1,000 feet. It is a record that will likely never be broken. So that's going to do it for us here. Remember, I'm Mike, the NYC Storyteller. If you liked what you saw today, please make sure that you like the video, comment on the video, subscribe to the channel, even click the notification bell and say, hey, I want to hear whatever crazy story you have for us next time. And until that time, I don't know, what am I supposed to say?